Hi, welcome to part 2 of a series I'm making about an old 3D modeling program that I wrote called ClayWorks, and all the versions of that, including ones that I didn't release, and I'll go into the why of that during this video. So at the end of university, I finished university I think in 1995, and I'd been working on the previous version of ClayWorks, which was the 2.x series. That was written in Pascal, and I started to butt up against the limitations of that platform with, as I mentioned in the last video, it didn't really allow you to access all the memory of the computer in an easy manner, and there were things I just couldn't do with it. So I converted the whole project to C++ and to use DOS4GW, which, if you're familiar with games like Doom, which I'm sure many people are, then you'll have seen DOS4GW. It just allowed software written in DOS to access all of the memory in a nice flat way, which, without all the complications of older addressing modes. So before I go into that, I'd like to take a little detour into what was going on in the university at the time. Now, back then, hardware acceleration wasn't really a thing, not at home at least, not for consumers. But there was a company called Silicon Graphics who made these absolutely amazing machines called the Silicon Graphics Workstation, the Indigo and things like that. Now, these were really expensive, between the price of a car and the price of a house, and you could not afford them. You have to be military or large film studios when making Jurassic Park and things like that, or universities. Now, the universities didn't have the really expensive models, or at least my university didn't. They had one of these, which was the Indie Workstation, but these were still really capable. These cost a few £1,000s rather than the ridiculous hundreds of thousands of pounds, and these allowed you to do hardware accelerated 3D back in the mid-90s. So they were still very specialized, but the programming interface on these will be familiar to many graphics programmers today. These were using OpenGL, so Minecraft is written in the same library that these were written in. Now, I don't know if anybody's actually managed to get Minecraft working on one of these, but it wouldn't surprise me if somebody did. They weren't by today's standard hugely fast, but for then they were absolutely mind-blowing. Now, I was working on ClayWorks 2.x at that point, which was in DOS and written in Pascal. I got friendly with the programmers in the postgrad lab, including one chap called Andy Coleburn. Now, Andy Coleburn liked the look of ClayWorks, and he asked me if I wanted to write a version for OpenGL and on Silicon Graphics machine. Now, at the time, that was a bit too much of a leap for me. I didn't have access to a machine like that at home, and I was still writing in Pascal and still thinking I could move forward, hoping that Ball and Pascal would introduce 32-bit addressing mode, so I didn't have to rewrite everything, and I could make use of that. But that didn't happen quickly enough for me, so I did convert it eventually to C++, like I said. But before then, Andy Coleburn was asking me if I wanted to write it for these, and looking back, what an amazing opportunity that would have been if I'd managed to get the time or get it working on an equivalent device. I did start writing in C++ at home. I think I got a copy of Microsoft Microsoft C++, which came on 11 floppy disks, some of which were always corrupt. Floppy disks, I'm so glad they're not a thing anymore. So I was using C++, but I was surprised as well by how slowly it compiled. I think I might have mentioned this in the last video, that Pascal compiles nice and fast. So I wasn't really feeling it for that at the time. But what Andy then did was he went ahead and wrote his own 3D modeling program, which is entirely separate from ClayWorks, but shares a little bit of its heritage. There's a little bit of influence there. I mean, it was influenced to write this because I couldn't write them on these systems, but he wrote it in a cross-platform way. He wrote it using the GTK toolkit. You can see it running on Windows XP there, but it ran on everything. It was very cross-platform, and he's still going with that, I believe, or His website's still up with www.invis.com. I'll leave a link in the description. And yeah, that's another example of a 3D modeling program from the time that not everybody might know, not everybody might be aware of. There's some of the heritage of ClayWorks influence in there with the extraction manipulators. I'm pretty sure other programs do those as well, but certainly not all of them, and I quite like them. So yeah, that was AC3D. So after university, I left and I got a job quite quickly at a company called Themekit, which is run by a friend of mine, Martin Robinson, who was developing similar software, and he saw ClayWorks and looked me up and had an interview, and I was quite excited because it very similar stuff. But this is an example of times when I've had to, because of conflicts of interest, just put ClayWorks to one side, which is really sad for me, but this software was really exciting and it was really, really nice to work with other programmers on things. And Martin's been a good friend and he was an excellent mentor to me over the years, and it certainly improved my C++ because that's obviously the language they were writing in. Now, this collection of tools, they were called MindFormer, MindSetter, and MindRender, and all with the mind prefix. And these were a series of tools. They were also written in DOS, but they made use of SVGA graphics mode, 8-bit SVGA graphics mode. The palette you can see there is all 8-bit. The screenshot there is after we'd been working together on this for a few years, and at that point there was my influence of the pixel art is starting to come through, the logos and little icons, and my default mode, if I'm just noodling away on a 3D modeling program, is to make spaceships and airplanes and things like that. It's because they're quite conducive to it, and find them easy to do. So here's one that I did all the way back then. You can see there's a few other screenshots we've got of it here, and I've got a video. I'll explain why it's a video, not me playing with it live in a moment. There was an animation system within MindFormer, the modeling program here. It was quite tricky to use, but also quite fun because of the challenge. You didn't have a visual editor for this. You literally said whether you wanted cosine or linear interpolation between two numbers, and then you set it going. But I managed to use that to make walking robots and various. In a moment, when I show you a video of this, I'll show you some of the other animations in there that were quite fun. So while some things were quite tricky to use, everything was there. There was all the things you might expect from a 3D modeling program were there, just not with the kind of interface you might expect now. There's some more examples. You can see here again the stretch manipulator. I think that was my influence again coming into MindFormer. I'm not sure if Martin did that before, but there's this kind of line of stretch manipulators in all 3D modeling programs that I've had something to do with. So on to the video of this. So let's have a little look. So here's MindRender starting up. You can see it in DOS 4GW there in the background. Add a little splash screen to start with. I wouldn't try emailing that address now. You won't get anywhere with it. But moving on. So within the editor you have this user interface. This viewer actually I think was mostly my work. This and the conversion of this through OpenGL to Windows. So I'll talk about that in a moment. More like with this viewer, we have this running quite a low resolution, so it kind of runs fast enough. If you can see there, that actual machine working in the corner there, that was a nice example of using these cosine animation system. It fit quite well with that. I think my pixel art as well has managed to find its way into this particular scene. Before I became a programmer, I think all I spent my time doing on the computer on my old Amiga was creating pixel art in DPaint, and because they're nice and low color, they fit quite nicely with this, and they're all sitting on the wall because there are only 256 colors to choose from here. So all these images made on the Amiga are quite a nice fit because they don't use up all of had a bit of spare texture palette space. The system reserved some colors at the bottom, and then after that it was free to use in texture. So it's quite a good fit for this because all these images use hardly any, 32 colors at most. When I look at this, I think there's a few missed opportunities. This was contemporary to Quake at the time, so it's not the 2.5D raycasting sort of engine that you had with Doom. This is full 3D texture mapping and fully perspective correct texture mapping as well. So the texture mapping on here, Martin did a great job with it, and it was clipped and texture mapped all, perspective correct and without glitches. So, but one thing we didn't do that I think really would have made this pop was have light maps like Quake did. Quake looked amazing, partly because of the light mapping system they had in there, which wouldn't have cost much more in terms of processing time because it cached them in. You could have with light mapping. What light mapping means is it stores all the lighting and the shadows are stored in lower resolution texture maps. So you have a pre-processing step where you render out all the light maps, and Quake did that. And I believe what they did when it was rendering is rather than blend those two in real time, the surface textures that you see and the light map, they would cache them. They would work out, you could move into a section and it would think, right, I've got all of these light maps to do, and I can merge them together. Now, we didn't write that. I think we considered it, and we had all the tools that we'd need to do that within this, but that really would have made this look that much better. But what we have here, I moved for a few scenes in the background there. There was a spaceship scene that I did in a space station. This scene here has in it a flying up in the corner. There is the company pet, which was actually Nigel, the sales guy's chinchilla. I was going to say chihuahua, but that's a little dog, isn't it? He's floating up there in the corner. Why is he floating? I don't know. But he was a grumpy little chinchilla called Taz, and he sat in the corner of the office snuffling away and trying to avoid humans. You got a better shot of the animating contraptions that I enjoyed doing when I was doing this. So at any rate, this is MindViewer. This is the software that we worked on at Themekit, and like I said, we did go into a number of we did make some updates to this. We did move it to Windows. We had a choice. It was a bit difficult at that time. It was a bit of a Wild West situation in terms of hardware acceleration. You had some graphics cards that really weren't worth touching, like the Matrox S3. Matrox are quite a well-respected company, but their first their first card that they released that was a build as a 3D hardware accelerator really wasn't up to much. I think I picked up one cheap and wasn't very impressed. They couldn't do texture mapping. They could only do Gurad shading, which is smooth shaded polygons, but it didn't seem any faster than software rendering, so that there was no particular advantage to it. Another one that was a lot better, and you could run Quake in this, and it ran really, really well, was the 3DFX card, Voodoo 3DFX. And that was a strange beast, though. You had to have a 2D graphics card, and you had to have the 3DFX would run as an overlay on top of that, and it had its own programming library, so it felt like a bit of a cul-de-sac, felt a bit of a dead end, and it turned out that was. We had a Themekit. We were trying to decide which of the two main graphics libraries, hardware accelerated graphics libraries, to go with as we were moving away from software rendering. And the choices back then were a very early version of DirectX and OpenGL. And it was a difficult choice, actually, because OpenGL had the advantage of being cross-platform and not Microsoft, and DirectX wasn't really very advanced at that point. So we went with OpenGL. I'm not sure if we actually had a card that ran OpenGL hardware accelerated, but we knew that they would be coming. The drivers would be coming at some point. So we wrote that. I don't have a copy of that, unfortunately. So all of this would run quite nice and fast in that. So that was my first real foray into OpenGL. So I'd been introduced to it at university on the SGI machines, but this is my first real experience programming in it. So I ported a whole viewer system to that, and later that was hardware accelerated. Now, at this point, I had I had personal reasons for wanting to be in Japan, and I managed to get a job over there. I managed to get a job offer over there. So I was quite happy in Themekit, but I had a job offer in Japan, and I had reasons for wanting to be over there. So at that point, I left Themekit and moved to Japan on good terms. Martin and I are still friends. So I left. The story behind that was the reason I wanted to go there was having an interview upstairs in a travel agency in Shinjuku, and I was downstairs waiting in the internet cafe they had downstairs from there, and I was whiling away my time. I downloaded my 3D modeling program, ClayWorks, which was free to download at that point. So I started playing with it just because I was a bit bored, and a chap approached me, a chap called Yasuki-san, and he asked me, what is this software? And I said, well, it's a project I've been working on. And he was pretty impressed with that and offered me a job on the spot. So the reason I was there, she came downstairs and said, Tim, I think I've got the job. And I turned around and said, I think I did too. So she was taken aback by that. And 6 months later, I was working in Japan in a travel agency as a web developer. So I was just very happy to be there. This was an incredible opportunity that just landed on my lap, and I wasn't going to let that get tossed in the mouth. So whilst I was there, I quite enjoyed web development because it especially at the time, I could mix my my artistic side, pixel art, and web development, and I ended up doing quite a lot of pixel art for this place. Whole websites made with pixel art. Things were changing, Photoshop and high color, but still low color devices were a thing. So there were real reasons to want to make handcrafted GIFs and things like that, and I really enjoyed doing that. So there was to go through some of the pixel art from back then. I think this is just a random collection of pixel art images. Some of them you would have seen in the Themekit background, and some of the more ones I actually did for that company. That one there was an example of a promo picture that was done, and they did quite a few of these within that. But I didn't really want to be a web developer. I think I maxed that job out. I did all the things they wanted me to do, and I was bored and just ended up trying to teach myself various server programming languages and all things like that. So from there, another kind of serendipitous thing happened, and I'm not quite sure how. I met somebody who knew somebody who worked at this other company, and he got us in touch. So there was a company called At.I in Tokyo who were writing engines, middleware they were called then, for PlayStation 2 and Xbox. And we had an interview was arranged, and I went to see them. And when I got to the interview, I thought, oh, you guys look really familiar. And they thought, oh yeah, we thought it was you. We just wanted to make sure you were all right before offering you a job, because I'd met them all before. When I'd gone to visit Japan a year previous, my boss Martin said to me, although he wasn't going there for work, he said, right, make yourself useful and go talk to these guys about trying to localize our software at Themekit into Japanese. So I went there, and I met all these guys, and we talked about what it would cost to translate all of our software to Japanese. It's complicated because it was in DOS, but we had a good conversation on that. But years later, in an interview, they've changed their name because they were the software branch of of a virtual reality company based in Leicester called Virtuality. Now, Themekit had a lot of dealings with those guys, so all of the Themekit software ran on all these ancient VR headsets, which were a little bit ahead of their time back then, with basically strapping CRT monitors to your head. I mean, all the ideas were there, but this is before hardware acceleration and lightweight displays. So now is the time for VR if it's ever going to happen. Back then, it was too early, but it was fun to be working on that stuff so early on. But anyway, virtuality went bust because for the reason I just mentioned. And AI Cube, their Japanese brand, bought themselves out and changed their name to AI Cube. And so that's why I didn't know that these are the people I was going to meet. So I did, and I got that job. So I changed jobs, and I was working in real-time 3D stuff again, which was my kind of happy place. So I was working there, and they worked on an engine called Zeos. Now, Zeos, if I just shut those down, and let's... they worked on an engine called Zeos. Now, Zeos, the only thing that people will be aware of, I think, these days, is a game that was written in Zeos called Guitar Man. I don't know how popular it was actually over here, but I think later on it's become a bit of a cult classic. I mentioned that our software was using this. Koei wrote it, but they used the Zeos engine. I'm not sure if anybody gets a credit in this. I'm not sure if Zeos or AI Cube are mentioned, or anybody at Koei are mentioned. I think there are. I don't think there's a credit scene. But it was our engine that we worked on, and so we were coding that, and we were working closely with Koei to make sure that this all worked. And this is a really fun game. It's quite unusual. There were a lot of rhythm games, there were a lot of rhythm music games out at the time, and this particular one was a rhythm and pitch. You kind of followed the pitch that the guitar was taking with the left stick, and then use the circle button, I think, to do the rhythm. It's really hard. This is me playing it here badly. Used to be really good at this. We were very competitive about this in the office. It follows us the typical story of boy meets girl, boy's dog turns boy into some sort of guitar Cyberman who battles other guitar warriors, the usual sort of thing. But it's insane and it's a lot of fun. So yeah, he's a bit whiny until his dog. I don't trust this dog. This dog is weird and does things like this. I've never had a dog that does that. So just have a little run through it. Here he is. What's happened to me? Fortunately, I've got the music. The music's quite good. This is the American version. I'm used to the Japanese version, but yeah, this is quite fun. So you can see that you control with the left stick the direction you're going in, and you've got to match these like in other rhythm games. It's all going left at the moment. Starts off easy, gets hard really quickly, and I'm going to have to practice a bit more again. Might introduce it to my family. I think they'll love it. So yeah, here it goes. And you see the pitch thing. There you go. So you have to follow that, and you can see me doing it really badly here. So that's something we worked on at AIQ, but it's a Koei game. They did most of it. I stayed in Japan for 3 years in total before coming back. I had to come back because I changed jobs, and the government didn't like the fact that I'd been brought over there to do this web programming job. But then I decided to do another job, and me and my naivety at the time didn't realise that would be an issue. But unfortunately, it was. So after 3 years, I had to go, and I went back to Britain to try and get a master's degree with a view to going back. So that's what I was working on over this time. But I still developed ClayWorks, and at the version that you can see here is the version I was working on at the time. Once I left Themekit, I was left with a 6-month gap where I was kind of jobbing, doing web programming contract jobs. I did a bit of work for HIS's London branch, just more pixel art for Japanese websites. And during that time, I think I'd started converting everything to C++ at that point, but I kind of finished that conversion, and I also took things in a bit of a different direction with the rendering. This is still software rendering in here, but instead of using 256 color mode, which was quite limiting, quite difficult to get nice looking graphics in there, I was using a 16-bit color mode for this, which is true color. You get 5 bits for red, 6 bits for green, and 4 bits for blue. And that means 32 shades of red and blue. So 32 different levels of color. If you imagine RGB color sliders, you'd get 32 steps. And then 64 steps of green. I think that eyes are more sensitive to green, so they gave a bit more to that. You can tell a bit of banding with this, but it's there is a bit of banding in the background, and that's because of or any gradiated shades. You'll see that the colors jump, I think, there in particular. But it was true color, which meant I could have RGB lighting, which meant I could do blending and transparency and nice fog effects like that, which is a big deal. Still not hardware accelerated, so although it ran quite fast, it was obviously not the way things were going. Here we have it running live rather than a slideshow. So just to take you through this a little bit, in terms of modeling, it's not really that much more advanced than the old DOS version. That's not really where I spent my my development time. I'd fixed a couple of problems. I think last time I mentioned there was an annoying bug with the extrusion, but that works fine now, and it's this was much more focused on polygon rendering than just wireframes, so it's much more important to have that running. This version and subsequent versions to this I didn't release. Now, there were various reasons for that. One, I wasn't a student anymore, I was working full time, so the support burden that I discovered was quite significant when I released this, the old 2.x versions, particularly in DOS. If you remember running games in DOS, it wasn't a straightforward thing. You had to set up all sorts of memory drivers, mouse drivers, sound card drivers, all of those sort of things just to get anything working. And you could make the assumption that anybody who was using that sort of software would be familiar with that, but I found I was spending quite a lot of time dealing with people that wanted to use ClayWorks but hadn't done any of that before. So sometimes I'd be quite angry it didn't work out of the box. You couldn't assume that people would just have machines set up the way you expected them to, as you would running a Windows machine. You can write software and expect everything to just work. So writing another DOS program, I was a little bit cautious of releasing something with that support burden. Also, I was growing a little bit embarrassed because it was still in DOS, and to be taken seriously, your software really ought to be in Windows at this point, I think around 97, 98, around that sort of time. So with that in mind, I converted this then to run in Windows, and that was the first attempt at that I did was, you can see it running here, and with this you see it was at the kind of high point of my software rendering engine in C++, but this is running in Windows. It might not look like it, but this used a DirectX library, a Microsoft library called DirectDraw, which allowed you to cheekily access the pixels of the screen directly, which is pretty much how I access them in DOS. So this offered me a nice smooth path from getting from DOS into Windows. I still knew I had to make it hardware accelerated, and for that I'd start using DirectX 7, which I'll talk about in the next version. That next version makes a bit of a departure with the way I looked at 3D modeling as well. I think up till this point my major focus had been, pretty basic 3D modeling, but more focus on the user interface and the software rendering library. But of course, moving to Windows, whilst the user interface was still my system, the rendering is now handled by DirectX, so that's no longer quite as interesting, particularly in DirectX 7 before pixel shaders, but we'll talk about those later. So at this point I had this version running in DirectDraw, and it would run pretty well on Windows machines at that time. You could run it in 16-bit mode, and I later wrote a version that would run in true color mode. So it would run on a wide variety of machines, and the software rendering, as you can see here, it was a similar sort of speed to that. I think this is running on a faster machine, but it was performant back then as well. You can see some issues with my texture mapping here. This was similar to the texture mapping you might see on a PlayStation 1, so wobbly affine textures. I had fixed this later in my Java re-implementation of the software engine. That was one last hurrah for my software rendering. Java applets became a thing on the web, which allowed you to do whatever you wanted within a little Java applet rather than rely on HTML, which meant I could render 3D graphics within those using my software engine. Didn't have OpenGL reliably running on those, so that was an avenue for me to kind of make extra use of that code, and I'm rather glad I did, because I think I made 3 games in that and a bunch of small demos, and that did quite well for me. So it was nice to get some actual mileage out of software that I'd written before it became redundant thanks to hardware acceleration. I fixed some of the issues you can see in here, although the rendering's quite nice. Like, there were issues with the affine texture mapping, and because of the affine texture mapping, I think clipping, when you move it to the side of the screen, you can see some of the things particularly wobble. So that was all fixed. Also, I did subpixel accuracy in the Java version, which means that as things move around the screen, the slopes of the edge of your polygons and lines change very slightly as it moves from one pixel to the next, and that just makes everything look really smooth. It's a really easy to implement thing, but you can really tell when somebody hasn't implemented it. They used it to great effect in Quake. I think if you remember, Quake had a kind of a track mode where it would just sit there and the camera would move very, very slightly, looking over a scene in one of the Quake levels. And I'm pretty sure the reason they did that very slight movement was to show the subpixel accuracy and really show how nice and accurate their kind of texture mapping was. Quake also did, to go back to Quake, I'm mentioning Quake a lot actually, because Quake was the ID Software's rendering were one of the best in the business, so we all looked to John Carmack and see what he was doing, because it's quite interesting. They had the problem again with the perspective correct texture mapping, the non-wobbly texture mapping. If you do that in a way other than a technique called constant Z, where you rasterize in a line where you can interpolate a value directly, you needed to do a divide every pixel in the kind of naive version of this. And that's quite expensive. A divide is actually one of the most expensive operations you can ask your CPU to do, or at least it was on those machines. So what John Carmack did was, if I'm remembering this right, he would every 8 pixels or so, he would do the divide by W to do the perspective correct texture mapping, and then linearly interpolate between those. So most of the pixels weren't doing that, but it looked just as good. So that was really awesome. Some of the techniques that they'd come up with to make this stuff run at interactive frame rates on the hardware of the time. So this is about as far as I took ClayWorks before moving to hardware acceleration. I really did want to release this version in a similar manner to the old DOS version. It was running stably enough at this point, but then everything kind of changed with Windows. They depreciated direct draw, and it became a real big no-no to be writing directly to the screen, which I kind of relied on because of the path I'd taken from DOS to Windows. And I was left in a situation where everything stopped working, and I couldn't possibly release it because I knew it wouldn't work on most machines at that point, which was terrible for me. So I was faced with having to rewrite it, and I'll talk more about that in the next video, because that rewrite was a significant departure, and I started doing more interesting things on the modeling side. So with that, I say thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in part 3. Please like and share, and mention in the comments if you want me to talk about anything in particular, or not talk about some things. And thank you again. Goodbye.